For numerous captured German soldiers, the initial jolt didn't occur on the field of battle, but upon their arrival at prisoner-of-war camps run by the Allies. Nazi propaganda had primed them to anticipate severe mistreatment, starvation, or potentially even execution at the hands of their adversaries. However, upon disembarking from the trucks or trains and crossing through the barbed wire entrances, they encountered circumstances that contradicted every single warning they had received. Guards maintained a firm demeanor but weren't brutal. Rations were adequate, and the Geneva Convention was clearly upheld in many camps. The realization that their captors had no intention of demeaning or annihilating them disturbed numerous men who had solely believed in extremes. It wasn't paradise, but it offered order, sustenance, and security, elements that seemed almost surreal after months of warfare. For young Wehrmacht soldiers barely out of their schooling, this abrupt shift was perplexing. They had traversed through devastated cities in France, the Soviet Union, and later within Germany itself, carrying solely the burden of destruction in their wake. Now under American or British control, they encountered meticulously arranged barracks, functional latrines, and regular nourishment. It was an entirely different realm, one that mirrored discipline yet lacked cruelty. Initially, their discussions were saturated with incredulity. They speculated how long such treatment might endure, questioning whether it was merely a facade before more harsh realities emerged. Nevertheless, as days evolved into weeks, numerous individuals began to discern something even more astonishing: prospects for education and individual development that no one could have anticipated amid a war. These initial impressions held immense significance. The Allied approach wasn't coincidental. American and British officials recognized that treating prisoners of war in accordance with international law could undermine Nazi propaganda and potentially reshape prisoners' attitudes. Certain guards even extended their actions, providing respect that prisoners hadn't expected. When officers addressed German captives as gentlemen or permitted them to communicate with their families, the psychological impact was substantial. For numerous prisoners of war, this marked the initial crack in the ideological framework that the Third Reich had erected around them. If their adversaries weren't the barbarians they had been cautioned about, then what other falsehoods might exist? The environment of these initial months also established the basis for the intellectual reawakening that would ensue. Devoid of battle directives, marches, or campaigns, prisoners possessed time, more than they knew how to utilize. Boredom gnawed at them. Certain individuals attempted to while away the days with endless card games, carving wood, or penning letters. However, soon enough, rumors began to spread that the camp authorities were arranging something unconventional. Flyers were affixed to notice boards, and announcements were conveyed through interpreters. Classes would be provided within the camps. Initially, it sounded preposterous. University-level instruction for defeated soldiers. Most presumed it was a ruse. Yet, indications of transformation were already apparent even before the formal initiation of these programs. Within some barracks, educated individuals had commenced gathering small groups, imparting knowledge to one another from memory or with whatever scraps of paper they could discover. A former schoolteacher might elucidate mathematics. A law student might outline fundamental principles of legal theory. These spontaneous endeavors unveiled a yearning for mental stimulation. The Allies acknowledged this and subtly fostered it, perceiving an opportunity to transform captivity into something more fruitful. However, the prisoners themselves, still reeling from the shock of surrender, remained uncertain. They hadn't yet grasped the extent of these opportunities, or the degree to which they would reshape the culture behind the wire. Therefore, the initial chapter of this narrative isn't about classrooms or lectures, but about disbelief. German soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy entered camps anticipating misery, only to discover that their captors would nourish them, clothe them, and, most surprisingly, grant them opportunities to learn. Prior to the emergence of books and blackboards, there existed the simple astonishment of survival, dignity, and an unforeseen path forward. That sense of contradiction between what they had been instructed to expect and what they now experienced became the foundation upon which the seeds of camp education would flourish. When the announcement ultimately arrived, it caught numerous prisoners off guard. During a morning roll call or a posted notice on the camp bulletin board, the message was unambiguous. The authorities were organizing classes that any prisoner could attend. The reaction was diverse. Some individuals scoffed, labeling it a propaganda tactic. Others whispered nervously that the Allies might exploit these lessons to re-educate them, to strip away their allegiance to Germany. And yet curiosity began to awaken because the prospect of learning offered something beyond routine drills and endless inactivity. The notion of education within barbed wire wasn't entirely improvised. The Allied nations, most notably the United States and Great Britain, had lengthy discussions regarding the appropriate handling of the numerous prisoners taken into custody following battles in North Africa and subsequently in France. By the year 1943, camps in America alone were housing several 100,000 German prisoners of war. Unoccupied soldiers could become unruly, incite conflict, or hold on to Nazi philosophies. Supplying structured educational opportunities satisfied a twofold need. It engaged the men's time and simultaneously introduced them to concepts that differed from National Socialist ideology. Although not yet termed denazification, the early signs were there. Representatives from entities such as the YMCA, which possessed a history of engagement with war detainees, backed these initiatives, furnishing reading materials and recommending lesson plans that resembled civilian education rather than military propaganda. The official declaration itself frequently included details that amazed the prisoners. The courses were set to encompass not only basic literacy but also advanced studies. The curriculum included mathematics, history, engineering, literature, and even foreign dialects. A German soldier, who had put his studies at Heidelberg University on hold to enlist in the Wehrmacht, recalled his disbelief. He recounted that they told them they could resume where they left off, which sounded mocking because how could one study in a prison camp? Many shared his skepticism, yet the authorities stood firm. The classes were promised to be legitimate, not just for show. Doubt lingered. Detainees devoted to Nazi beliefs cautioned others that these classes were traps. They insisted that participating would mean betraying their homeland. In certain camps, clandestine Nazi factions attempted to scare off potential students, warning them that their actions would be judged upon their return. However, the more realistic prisoners thought differently. The war had ravaged their residences, their livelihoods, and sometimes their loved ones. The chance to learn during confinement presented a hint of advancement during what would otherwise be wasted time. As days turned into months, the allure of attending a lecture, of stimulating the intellect rather than succumbing to hopelessness, grew increasingly irresistible. There were also tangible advantages. Prisoners who participated in educational programs occasionally received minor perks, better job assignments, access to more reading materials, and even the respect of guards who perceived them as less problematic. Some German officers were among the initial enrollees, understanding that their involvement might encourage the lower ranks to follow suit. In a select few camps, registration lists quickly reached capacity, prompting administrators to establish numerous classrooms in various barracks. In other locations, progress was slower, with only the most inquisitive or driven individuals signing up. What impacted numerous men the most was the idea that their captors sought to provide them with something productive. They had anticipated hostility, perhaps even revenge, yet instead they received invitations to sit in classrooms and take on the roles of students. Again, for individuals who had been uprooted from universities, apprenticeships, or teaching positions, the offer rekindled long-dormant ambitions. A captured Luftwaffe cadet later remembered, "It was the first time I felt that I might have a future beyond the war." Books and lessons meant that life was not entirely wasted. The announcement phase, therefore, marked a pivotal moment. On one side were those who maintained suspicion and bitterness. On the other were the curious and the optimistic. Both groups resided within the same barbed wire confines, yet their paths within the camp would soon diverge. With the initial classes scheduled and the first teachers coming forward, what had seemed like an improbable rumor was about to change the daily routine of captivity. The conversion of standard prison barracks into makeshift learning areas was an extraordinary sight. Rows of beds were pushed aside to create open areas, and tables were neatly arranged in straight lines to mimic a lecture hall setting. Blackboards, sometimes contributed by aid organizations, sometimes fashioned from painted wood, were positioned at the front. Chalk and notebooks appeared, frequently distributed in limited quantities, yet still more than many had considered achievable behind barbed wire. German prisoners of war, accustomed to viewing barracks solely as places for sleep and detention, unexpectedly discovered themselves entering spaces that resonated with discussion instead of silence. Camp libraries, which had started as small collections, played a vital role in this shift. Donations poured in from American colleges, churches, and community organizations. Dictionaries, historical records, technical guides, and even pieces of literature in both German and English were delivered. Certain camps reported holdings surpassing 10,000 books, which was remarkable for locations that, just months prior, were filled with exhausted soldiers still traumatized from battle. Reading materials were not solely for academic reasons. They also offered a glimpse into a wider world, presenting viewpoints that many had never encountered during their time under the Reich's censorship. The simple act of setting up a classroom was significant. Captured soldiers noticed that Allied authorities were committed to proving that learning could prosper even when people were held as prisoners. In certain camps, the German captives themselves fashioned seats and tables using leftover wood pieces. They meticulously wrote the numbers of rooms on the doors, prepared timetables, and displayed notices promoting various academic areas. The overall atmosphere started feeling more like a compact educational institution instead of a military jail. In fact, one American camp leader wrote in his official report that the prisoners' intense commitment to transforming their living quarters into schools took the guards by complete surprise, as they had believed these men would remain uninterested. Proper behavior in these newly created educational settings was essential. Prisoner soldiers got to their classes punctually, carrying their notebooks, and greeted their teachers in a formally respectful way. For many, it marked the initial chance to immerse themselves in an organized intellectual environment, ever since the conflict had prematurely pulled them away from their institutions of higher learning or their training programs. The seriousness they demonstrated while studying highlighted not only a deep hunger for knowledge, but additionally a yearning for personal worth. Education turned into a means of regaining influence over their lives, which had otherwise been predominantly governed by regulations and imprisonment. The adaptation process wasn't entirely problem-free. The available space was quite limited. In particular camps, it was not uncommon to see 2 or 3 groups utilizing the same small building, with just subtle dividers or scheduled time slots separating them. Quite often, the lessons were in direct conflict with the loud environment of regular camp life, which included the sounds of meal preparation, the yelling in the exercise area, and the distinct sounds produced by the guard's shoes on the stone surface. However, despite these difficulties, there was a general feeling of strong dedication. People studying would move closer to better hear the lectures, jot down notes in the faint light of lanterns, and participate in conversations related to projects well past the time when classes were officially over. An intriguing thing was observed in numerous camps, which was the construction of boards for writing that had detailed images of machines, maps, and even designs for buildings. The prisoners who were previously engineers produced elaborate technical drawings, turning the plain walls into valuable tools for instruction. Such visual aids were both useful in practice and highly encouraging, demonstrating that even while being held in confinement, people can use their creative thinking to design bridges, engines, and city designs. It was not at all uncommon for a visitor to enter into a living area and find mathematical problems spread across the board, sketches of old churches, or language exercises written in both English and French. Something that started as a simple test quickly gained momentum. Within mere weeks, schedules became full. The classrooms were filled with movement, and the prisoners had changed their daily routines to focus on lessons and projects. The wired fences remained in position and the observation post still stood tall. Yet within the accommodations, a different world had taken shape, where the predictable routines of being held captive gave way to the organized structure of learning. In this unusual environment, The men who once held firearms now carried books, and the walls of the living quarters that at one time echoed with feelings of sadness now resonated with classroom readings, discussions, and the sounds of pens writing. Among the most noteworthy features of the learning environments within the camp was the discovery of an unforeseen group of educators from inside the confinement area itself. A large number of the German prisoners were not just randomly selected soldiers or farmers, but were individuals possessing higher levels of education and expertise in their fields. Former university teachers, instructors from secondary schools, legal professionals, engineers, and even musicians discovered they were all dressed in the same clothing as regular soldiers. When the educational opportunities were announced, these individuals unexpectedly gained significant importance. Rather than just disappearing into the background of captivity, they made themselves known and started running the lessons. Their understanding converted the camp into a strange learning community. Certain individuals gained recognition within the prisoner community. One lecturer of philosophy who had been captured from Munich started providing nighttime study groups on Kant and Nietzsche, which attracted many interested listeners who filled up a repurposed hut. A former building designer lectured on the basics of design, drawing examples of building strategies on homemade writing surfaces, while former medical students put together courses in human anatomy using only images they remembered. One prisoner, who was once a Latin teacher, taught regular grammar courses that grew to be so well attended that Allied officers occasionally came to visit out of pure interest. For a great many prisoner soldiers, it marked the first instance they experienced such specialized teaching, since not all of them had studied at a higher education level before the war began. The structured arrangement of these teaching efforts was surprisingly official. Groups of prisoners organized schedules, selected teachers, and even gave out certificates for finishing the courses. While these documents held no actual importance outside of the camp, they came to represent accomplishments within the camp environment. Men who had previously fought together now respectfully sat in front of fellow prisoners who had become their instructors. Power shifted away from military status and went to intellectual skills, which was a significant change from the structure they had known while in uniform. The existence of highly educated people also contributed to the diverse selection of topics that were provided. A captured chemical scientist from Hamburg might lead discussions about chemical processes, while an economist would explain market ideas unknown to others. At one camp located in the American Midwest, a specialist in musical history organized lectures on the history of classical music and included simple shows using instruments the YMCA provided. These sessions weren't just about sitting down and absorbing facts. Attending a class in camp was like stepping through a hidden door, one that led out of the relentless grind of survival and into a world where minds mattered again. For many prisoners, these lessons became a form of escape, a way to remember that life could be more than just the next roll call or ration. The act of gathering around a makeshift chalkboard, of poring over books and notes, reminded them that they were part of something larger, an intellectual community, even if it existed behind barbed wire. Instead of simply marking time, they found themselves drawn into lively debates, collaborative problem-solving, and moments of genuine curiosity. Learning became a rare privilege, a shared experience that transcended the bleakness of their daily routines. The relationship between prisoners and their peer instructors was often complicated. It wasn't as simple as sitting down and accepting knowledge from someone else. Some men chafed at the idea of being taught by those who, before the war, had been university professors, lawyers, or engineers, figures who might have once held social or academic authority over them. Old hierarchies reasserted themselves in subtle ways, and past resentments occasionally flickered to the surface. When political ideology entered the mix, things could get combustible. Teachers with known liberal leanings or a history of criticizing the Nazi regime risked open hostility from die-hard National Socialists. Some of these hardliners went so far as to label their instructors traitors, sparking heated arguments that sometimes threatened to derail the fragile sense of community. Yet, for all the tension, a powerful drive persisted. The hunger to learn, to reclaim some sense of self, often triumphed over the temptation to settle old political scores. Camp administrators, observing this unexpected outbreak of educational energy, quietly chose to support it. They recognized the positive effects. Men occupied with study were less likely to cause trouble, and morale generally improved. With subtle encouragement, they arranged for extra supplies to reach the most educated prisoners, solicited book donations from outside organizations, and provided precious paper for assignments and exams. In these small acts, the authorities helped build an unlikely oasis of learning, a miniature academic world that flourished in the shadow of captivity. For the prisoners, the presence of real teachers, people who had once stood at the front of lecture halls or written scholarly articles, became a lifeline. It was proof that their identities hadn't vanished with their freedom. They were still thinkers, professionals, and creators, not just anonymous numbers in a system designed to erase individuality. In this environment, hidden talents re-emerged. The same man who had spent weeks digging ditches or repairing fences could now argue the finer points of legal philosophy or unravel the mysteries of advanced mathematics. In a place where dignity was in short supply, intellectual life restored a measure of self-worth. As the educational program gained momentum, its scope quickly expanded. What began as a few men reading together or sharing knowledge grew into a complex, structured endeavor. Makeshift classrooms took shape in barracks, with blackboards fashioned from scrap wood and benches dragged from the mess hall. Schedules were drawn up and attendance tracked. The heart of it all became the curriculum, which soon impressed even the most skeptical German prisoners. This wasn't remedial instruction or simple literacy training. The courses offered rivaled those at established universities, with a depth and breadth that surprised everyone. Mathematics covered everything from basic arithmetic to topics like calculus and differential equations, taught by former mathematicians or engineers who relished the chance to teach again. History lessons explored Germany's own complex past, but also ventured into subjects previously censored by Nazi propaganda. The workings of American democracy, the principles of British constitutional law, and the broader currents of world history. Prisoners confronted uncomfortable truths about the war, colonialism, and the mechanisms by which democracies and dictatorships rose and fell. Language instruction became one of the most sought-after and practical offerings. English classes were packed, as men hoped fluency would help them communicate better with their captors, or even open doors in a post-war world. Those looking for an edge tried their hand at French, Spanish, or Russian. The ability to speak another language was more than a skill. It was a promise of mobility, a way to imagine a future beyond the wire. Recognizing this, some camps introduced courses in economics, business, and agriculture, subjects with direct relevance to rebuilding shattered lives after release. Technical and vocational training flourished, especially among prisoners with backgrounds in industry or mechanics. Lessons often came with real tools, diagrams, and even salvaged equipment, giving these classes the feel of bona fide trade schools. For many, this practical education offered hope that they could return home with marketable skills, ready to start anew. Yet the curriculum was not all work and no reflection. Philosophy and literature carved out their own important space. Through readings of Goethe, Schiller, and Thomas Mann, prisoners reconnected with a German cultural heritage that had been twisted and co-opted by the regime. These discussions became emotional battlegrounds, where ideas about freedom, morality, and responsibility were dissected and debated. The arts, too, found a way in. Painting, drawing, and music brought color and sound into drab surroundings. Watercolor workshops and drawing classes provided creative outlets, while evening concerts featuring Bach and Beethoven became moments of solace and shared humanity. For many men, these artistic endeavors did more than pass the time. They were a form of therapy, a means of healing minds battered by war and captivity. The entire educational enterprise was marked by a surprising degree of rigor. Lessons followed syllabi, students received reading lists, and exams were administered with seriousness. In some American camps, the curriculum was developed in consultation with local universities, ensuring that the material met real academic standards. The Red Cross and YMCA played crucial roles, shipping in textbooks on everything from law and agriculture to physics and literature, while German-English dictionaries circulated among the students. Reports from the period describe prisoners hunched over notebooks, crammed with mathematical proofs, essays, translations, and diagrams. The same kind of academic work being done by students in free societies. For those who had been forced to abandon their educations to fight, these classes offered a vital sense of continuity, a link to the lives they hoped to reclaim. The act of learning, of striving for knowledge in the face of adversity, became an act of resistance, a way to assert humanity and hope, even when freedom seemed impossibly far away. A scientific scholar captured in Italy may want to resume anatomy lessons. A regulation scholar taken prisoner in Normandy may want to preserve his exploration of Roman regulation and worldwide statutes. Others found totally new fields, branching into philosophy or political concept for the primary time. The experience that point and captivity may be was something beneficial steadily changed the melancholy of wasted years. This wide-ranging curriculum additionally uncovered guys to views that challenged their preceding worldview. Learning approximately American constitutional standards or the French Revolution compelled many to impeach the authoritarian systems that they'd grown up beneath. For the Allies, this became exactly the point. Education now no longer best saved prisoners busy, however additionally recommended them to assume futures one of a kind from what the Reich had promised. While a few resisted such influence, others determined themselves quietly transformed, their minds reshaped via way of means of discussions that were unthinkable, returned domestic beneath Nazi censorship. Thus, the curriculum have become the centerpiece of the camp schools. It became ambitious, structured, and astonishingly diverse, reflecting each the Allies' strategic desires and the prisoners' starvation for highbrow life. In those improvised universities, at the back of fences and defend towers, know-how have become each a device of survival and a seed of change. The achievement of the camp curriculum depended closely on get admission to 2 books and gaining knowledge of materials. And right here the position of outdoor corporations proved decisive. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the YMCA, and numerous church companies throughout America and Britain mobilized to deliver prisoners with analyzing rely on an exceptional scale. Shipments of German-language volumes arrived in crates, starting from classical literature and technical manuals to agricultural handbooks and dictionaries. In a few camps, the range of to-be-had titles rivaled that of small schools returned domestic. One camp in Texas boasted almost 15,000 books, even as others inside the Midwest cataloged their holdings with such precision that they maintained functioning card index library systems. The presence of those libraries created a way of life of analyzing that became nearly obsessive. Men who had not often opened a e-book earlier than the conflict now coded as much as borrow volumes. The regulations of captivity and the shortage of distractions intended that analyzing have become one of the few escapes to be had. Borrowed books circulated fast through the barracks exceeded hand-handy till they fell aside from use. Some prisoners saved meticulous notes, copying passages into notebooks due to the fact that they feared they might now no longer see the books once more as soon as repatriated. The fee located on a well-worn replica of GA or a technical engineering textual content became extraordinary. With a few volumes dealt with like treasures, the Allies noticed the distribution of books as greater than a goodwill gesture. It became a strategic selection to counter boredom, keep order, and inspire highbrow boom that would melt Nazi ideology. But for the prisoners, the libraries took on which means that went a long way past strategy. They have become locations of quiet shelter in which guys may want to lose themselves in novels, philosophy, or science. Some even talked about the camp library because the best area in which they felt the experience of freedom, because the creativeness allowed them to tour a long way past the fences. The range of fabric amazed many Ps. Alongside works of German classics had been translations of American authors, inclusive of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, in addition to French literature or even Russian novels. Scientific texts protected current advances in chemistry, physics, and biology, giving technically minded guys a risk to hold tempo with traits they could have in any other case missed. Religious texts had been plentiful, taking into consideration Bible take a look at companies and theological discussions that delivered every other measurement to camp life. The bodily association of those libraries regularly reflected civilian institutions. Books had been prepared via way of means of subject. Shelves had been created from wooden scavenged with inside the camp, and prisoner librarians saved order with seriousness. Some camps even issued library playing cards stamped with dates and signatures, mimicking the outdoor world. The act of borrowing and returning books bolstered the experience of normally reminding guys that highbrow area may want to exist even in captivity. It became commonplace for lecture rooms and libraries to paintings hand in hand. A arithmetic trainer would possibly assign readings from a donated textbook, even as a language teacher recommended college students to seek advice from dictionaries or literature for practice. In this way, the libraries prolonged the attain of the camp curriculum, giving college students equipment for impartial take a look at. Beyond formal lessons, they fostered a way of life of self-development in which guys decided on books that spoke to non-public interests. A soldier who had as soon as been a farmhand would possibly borrow agricultural treatises at the same time as a younger musician explored the records of composition. The importance of those libraries persisted lengthy after the struggle fair. Many former PWs later recalled the primary EE book they study in captivity as a turning point, an awakening of interest in an area in which depression may want to effortlessly dominate. The quiet areas among shelves, the scratch of pens taking notes, the whisper of fellows debating passages. All of this made the libraries a ways extra than repositories of paper. They have been the lifeblood of the camp colleges, evidence that even in confinement, the pursuit of expertise couldn't be extinguished. By the time the libraries have been flourishing, and publications had settled into recurring, day-by-day instructional lifestyles, inside the camps had began to resemble that of an actual university. The mornings regularly began out with roll name and fundamental camp duties. However, as soon as chores have been complete, guys dispersed to their assigned instructions. Schedules have been pinned up on bulletin boards. Arithmetic at 9 hours, literature at 11 hours. Language training inside the afternoon. Bells or shouted bulletins every so often marked transitions simply as they could in a college returned home. For prisoners, this everyday rhythm of observe introduced shape to days that in any other case blurred collectively in monotony. Attendance turned into voluntary. However, participation grew steadily. In a few camps, upwards of 60% of the prisoners have been engaged in a few shape of observe, whether or not formal instructions or unbiased reading. The sight of fellows on foot throughout the camp compound sporting notebooks beneath their fingers have become acquainted to guards. Groups fashioned beneath bushes in heat climate, with improvised tutorials taking region inside the open air. When iciness made the barracks bloodless and drafty, prisoners wrapped themselves in blankets at the same time as being attentive to lectures through candlelight. The dedication to maintain studying notwithstanding pain discovered simply how deeply the initiative had taken root. Examinations have been introduced, and even though they carried no reputable popularity at first, they have been dealt with seriousness. Papers have been written, assignments graded, and college students took delight in passing tests. In a few cases, American and British universities agreed to well-known finished coursework after the struggle fair, giving the packages tangible value. The University of Kansas and numerous establishments in Britain cooperated through sending syllabi, examination models, and recommendation in order that the educational requirements inner barbed twine reflected the ones outside. For many prisoners, this supposed that captivity can be changed into impossibility in preference to a useless end. Debates have become every other hallmark of camp highbrow lifestyles. Organized dialogue societies flourished in which guys argued approximately politics, economics, and philosophy. Topics ranged from the legacy of Bismarck to the reasons of the First World War and the character of democracy. These debates may want to emerge as heated with Nazi loyalists clashing towards the ones extra open to opportunity perspectives. Yet even if tempers flared, The very act of changing thoughts fostered a subculture of debate that were in large part absent inside the inflexible authoritarian ecosystem of the Third Reich. The rhythms of instructional lifestyles additionally overlapped with inventive expression. Theater troupes staged plays, regularly diversifications of German classics or Shakespeare, carried out in translation. Music ensembles held recital, every so often alongside lectures on records or theory. These activities drew huge audiences, turning schooling into enjoyment and vice versa. The line among cultural enrichment and educational observe blurred till the camp felt like a small, however colorful, highbrow community. There turned into, however, an undercurrent of challenge. Some prisoners noticed those sports as distractions from the bleak fact of struggle fare and defeat. They argued that lectures and debates couldn't erase the barbed twine or the truth that their hometown turned into in ruins. But for others, day-by-day instructional lifestyles turned into a survival mechanism. To take a seat down in a classroom, to recognition on fixing an equation or translating a passage of literature, turned into to reclaim humanity in surroundings designed to strip it away. The camp directors took note of the wonderful effects. Reports stated that prisoners worried in schooling have been much less possibly to reason trouble, extra cooperative in painting's details, and usually more healthy in spirit. For the Allies, this showed that the educational recurring turned into extra than a luxury. It turned into a sensible device for keeping order. For the prisoners, it turned into something deeper, a hazard to stay with purpose, even in captivity. The chalk dirt on their hands, the notebooks full of scribbled formulation and essays have become symbols of resilience towards depression. As the camp colleges expanded, now no longer each prisoner welcomed them with enthusiasm. Beneath the floor of orderly training and bustling libraries, tensions simmered. A tremendous range of PSWs remained unswerving to the Nazi regime, and that they regarded the instructional tasks with deep suspicion. To them, those instructions have been not anything much less than an Allied try to reprogram German squaddies and weaken their loyalty. In a few camps, underground agencies of hardline countrywide socialists attempted to deter attendance. Caution that all of us who joined lectures on politics or democracy might be branded a traitor as soon as repatriated. Threats have been whispered inside the barracks, and intimidation on occasion changed into bodily violence. This divide regularly created awesome subcultures inside the wire. On one facet stood the keen college students hungry to research and to put together for existence after the struggle fare. On the opposite facet have been the resistant factions who spent their time imposing ideological area, elevating Nazi flags in mystery, or preserving clandestine meetings. For camp government, those tensions posed an actual challenge. Education were intended to lessen unrest. However, now it risked stirring struggle among opposing prisoner factions. Guards on occasion needed to interfere while fights broke out over whether or not participation inside the instructions became honorable or dishonorable. The Allied organizers, however, identified the significance of permitting debate instead of suppressing it outright. They accredited a diploma of ideological dialogue inside the instructions, reasoning that open speak became most effective to mystery plotting. The end result became that schoolrooms on occasion changed into battlegrounds of ideas. A lecture on political records may devolve right into a shouting in shape among guys protecting authoritarianism and people exploring democratic principles. Yet even those clashes served a purpose. They compelled prisoners to confront contradictions of their worldview, something that might by no means had been tolerated beneath Nazi rule. Suspicion prolonged past politics. Some prisoners questioned whether or not the Allies have been monitoring attendance lists to perceive who is probably sympathetic to democracy. Others feared that participation in instructions might cause them to seem susceptible or disloyal in the event that they ever again to Germany. A consistent anxiety existed among interest and fear, with a few guys sneaking into instructions quietly, sitting on the back, and leaving earlier than discussions ended. These small acts of warning contemplated how precarious camp society may want to be, even inside the midst of obvious highbrow revival. Despite the skepticism, there have been additionally gestures of defiance that changed into accidental opportunities. In one camp, A collection of dedicated Nazis tried to arrange their personal counterlectures, coaching prisoners approximately German Navy records and nationalist philosophy. Camp government allowed those gatherings to a point, understanding that publicity to contrasting viewpoints regularly advocated debate instead of inflexible conformity. In time, a few college students drifted from the Nazi-led classes to the wider camp curriculum in which they discovered extra range and highbrow stimulation. The weather of distrust became now no longer restricted to prisoners alone. Some guards involved that giving German squaddies get entry to books and schooling may cause them to too comfortable, softening the fact of captivity. Reports circulated wondering whether or not it became smart to break prisoners who had fought so fiercely towards Allied troops. Yet the results, decreased violence, fewer breakout attempts, and better morale, normally silenced such criticisms. Education proved greater powerful at preserving order than harsher area might have been. These tensions underscored the delicate stability of camp existence. Every study room dialogue, each borrowed book carried a weight a ways past its situation matter. To take a look at inside the camp became now no longer clearly an highbrow choice, however additionally a political act, one that would appeal to suspicion from fellow prisoners or even scrutiny from one's personal conscience. Yet inside the lengthy run, the willingness of such a lot to hold notwithstanding the dangers confirmed how sturdy the choice for information had become. Behind barbed wires, schooling became by no means neutral. It became a conflict among beyond loyalties and destiny possibilities. Over time, the instructions commenced to provide results that reached a ways past the each-day ordinary of camp existence. Men who had as soon as entered captivity, hardened and embittered, began out to show surprising transformations. For a few, the very act of reading rekindled pursuits that they'd buried while struggle fare disrupted their lives. A younger infantryman who had left in the back of a half-completed apprenticeship in engineering now pored over diagrams of machinery, dreaming of a destiny in which he may lay out in place of destroy. A captured regulation student, separated from his college in Berlin, resumed his research beneath the steering of fellow prisoners and imagined returning domestic to paintings in reconstruction instead of ideology. The publicity to unexpected topics regularly broadened international views. Soldiers who had recognized simplest, the inflexible certainties of Nazi propaganda, discovered themselves debating questions of ethics, governance, and responsibility. A philosophy seminar at the works of Immanuel Kant sparked discussions approximately obligation and morality that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian values they were taught. Language instructions brought them now no longer simply to English grammar, however, additionally to idioms, literature, and cultural expressions that made the enemy's sense much less alien. This initial shift, though subtle, intensified as more men recognized that education could equip them for new roles in post-war Germany. Artistic and cultural endeavors further fueled these transformations. A former factory worker, now a prisoner, discovered a passion for sketching during art classes, creating drawings that reflected both the harshness of his confinement and the promise of renewal. Musicians, provided with donated instruments, formed ensembles that blended study with performance. These activities served as a reminder of their humanity, illustrating that identity could be reclaimed not through ideology or military status, but through creativity and personal development. The psychological effects were equally significant. The routine of imprisonment often led to feelings of despair, yet education provided a sense of purpose. Prisoners expressed excitement about their classes, taking pride in mastering challenging texts or solving difficult equations. For many, this marked their first experience of agency after years of following orders and conforming. They gained not only knowledge but also confidence, fostering the belief that they could shape their futures once the war concluded. These changes were not without repercussions. Some former Nazis began to distance themselves from their previous beliefs, quietly voicing doubts in private discussions. Others, who had previously been indifferent, became deeply involved in intellectual pursuits, viewing them as opportunities for personal reconstruction. The transformation was inconsistent and not universal. Many men resisted or remained unaffected. However, the introduction of education undeniably changed the atmosphere of captivity. Allied observers noted this shift and reported on it with keen interest. Psychological assessments indicated that many prisoners of war, PSWs, who engaged in educational activities, displayed greater adaptability and optimism about the future. Camp officials referred to this as a civilizing effect. Yet the reality was more nuanced. It was less about civilization and more about rediscovery. These men were reclaiming aspects of themselves that had been lost to war and ideology, consciously or unconsciously, preparing for reintegration into a world that had moved on without them. In some camps, graduation ceremonies took place, where certificates were presented in front of fellow prisoners. Although unofficial, these small events held significant symbolic value. Men stood proudly as their names were called, celebrating not military achievements, but academic efforts. In those moments, the barbed wire seemed to fade, replaced by the illusion of being part of a normal society once again. This sense of transformation, of becoming more than just a prisoner number, represented one of the most lasting legacies of the camp schools. As the war came to an end and repatriation commenced, the true importance of the camp schools became clear. Thousands of German PSWs returned home, not only with memories of their captivity, but also with notebooks, certificates, and enhanced skills. For many individuals, these educational lessons provided the only sense of continuity during years filled with turmoil. A former literature student returned to Germany with a resolve to pursue a teaching career, while others who had studied engineering or agriculture during their imprisonment stepped directly into roles essential for the reconstruction of a devastated nation. Classes that were once regarded as mere distractions transformed into vital pathways toward sustainable livelihoods in a country striving to recover from destruction. The Allies recognized the long-term effects of the educational initiatives they had supported. Reports from both Britain and the United States indicated that prisoners who participated in educational programs often reintegrated into society more smoothly upon their release. They were less likely to remain politically radicalized and more inclined to take on constructive roles in post-war society. This was not simply a byproduct. It was part of a broader vision of re-education, executed in a manner that was subtler and more humane than the forced indoctrination feared by skeptics within the camps. Some narratives became almost legendary. A young law student captured in Normandy resumed his studies after being repatriated and eventually became a judge in post-war Germany. Former medical students who had taken anatomy courses in the camp went on to complete their training and serve in hospitals that were in dire need of staff. Even tradesmen who had studied technical manuals behind barbed wire found their expertise in demand as factories and infrastructure were rebuilt. For these individuals, their time in captivity, though humiliating and challenging, unexpectedly prepared them for life after defeat. The impact of this legacy extended beyond Germany. American and British institutions that had supported these educational programs viewed them as evidence that humane treatment could yield results that brutality could not. Universities that had shared curricula or donated textbooks occasionally received letters years later from former prisoners of war expressing their gratitude. This initiative, although born out of wartime necessity, illustrated that education could serve as a bridge between former enemies, easing hostility and sowing the seeds for future collaboration. Within Germany, the influence of these camp schools resonated quietly yet persistently. Many returning prisoners shared their experiences, encouraging peers who had never left the Reich to reevaluate the narrow ideological confines of their upbringing. Some veterans later admitted that their first serious exposure to democratic values, free debate, and even open access to literature occurred not in their homeland but during their time in captivity. The irony was not lost on them. It was only as prisoners that they experienced true intellectual freedom. The long-term effects of this experience were reflected in the educational system of post-war West Germany. Many former prisoners of war who had taken part in educational classes went on to become teachers, professors, or administrators, bringing with them a deep appreciation for open dialogue and structured learning. Although their contributions were rarely acknowledged directly, They played a significant role in the democratization and modernization of German education during the 1950s and beyond. The makeshift universities within the barbed wire had left a lasting mark on the nation's intellectual revival. For many, the memories of those camp classrooms remained vivid throughout their lives. Years later, memoirs recounted the striking contrast of watchtowers alongside blackboards, with guards stationed outside while students inside engaged in discussions about Plato or tackled geometry problems. Some recalled the biting cold of winter lessons, while others cherished the excitement of reading their first foreign novel. What connected these memories was the understanding that education had preserved their dignity amid adversity. Thus, the narrative of these camp schools did not conclude with liberation. It continued through the lives of thousands who transformed what could have been wasted years into a foundation for their futures. Behind the wire, they discovered not only survival but also renewal. That legacy persisted, influencing individuals and communities long after the last camp gates had swung open.